Hi everyone. In this video, I will be explaining voluntary movements. Okay. Before we start, I just wanted to tell you guys a funny story. So I actually recorded, I was quote unquote recording this video, and I wanted to upload it as fast as possible, right? I forgot to check whether I was recording or not. Um, and I think I just wasted 30 minutes recording this video. But then again, it was kind of I kept repeating stuff, so I think maybe re-recording the lecture was the best idea anyway. But okay, funny story. Anyway, coming back into the video. The first thing we're gonna talk about is defining voluntary, right? So since it's a dark color, I'm gonna write voluntary means that you decide to do it. You decide, right? I like to think about it as like I am voluntarily doing this. I am voluntarily I volunteer myself. I consent to it, right? That's voluntary movement. So now let's talk about spinal circuits. So you have your spinal cord, right? This tube-like structure that's in your vertebrae, protected by your vertebral column. Basically, there are usually chains of neurons that link downwards, right? And they basically receive information and send out information, right? They receive sensory and send out all of the motor information, right? So basically, why spinal circuits are important is just that they are responsible for majority of the communication. They're like your communication highway. They relay information to the brain and they send out information from the brain. So they're like highways almost. Let's write that. Highways. Okay. So then let's talk about something called central pattern generator. So in your brain, let's say that this is my brain, right? Cerebellum, brainstem, temporal lobe. So say this is my brainstem, right? Oh, I should have drawn a little bulge. Think of this as a little bulge. And your little spinal cord, right? Okay, so basically what happens here is that in your brainstem, which is like an extension of your spinal cord, you have a small group of neurons, right? Say these are little neurons, which produce the rhythm for which produce a certain rhythm. So before we get into this, let me ask you to think about something. When you start walking, right? Have you ever thought about you always walk in a systematic manner? You hear equidistant clanks, right? So like if you're when your boot hits the ground, let's call that sound a clink. You don't hear one clink and then 15 seconds later you hear another clink. And then immediately 3 seconds later you hear another clink. No. It'll be in constant intervals of 3 seconds, maybe a little less, a little more. You'll hear walking, like you'll hear equidistant clinks, right? And so what this does is it's essentially a rhythm. Your body needs to maintain a constant rhythm for movement, right? So this rhythm is used for walking. It's used for walking, swimming, 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 even in birds flying. And I actually just wanted to bring this up too. When you hear a hummingbird, the reason you hear a constant vibration sound is because the hummingbirds move their wings so fast and so evenly. You hear that little constant zig, 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 zig sound, right? So yeah, just wanted to bring this up. These are super important. Central pattern generator is a common question on the brain beat, so I just wanted to point that out. Then let's talk about how our body initiates the movement in the first place. So in our brain, let me draw out our beautiful brain. That's the cerebellum, that's the brainstem. Bulge here to represent the pons, okay? Okay, so let's say this marks the boundary of the frontal lobe. It's huge, right? Maybe not that huge, but you get the point. So let's say I want to initiate a movement. I think to myself, I want to grab that glass of water. How do I do that? So in your frontal lobe, there's a thin strip of tissue called your motor cortex. So this is where your ideas are started, right? This is where your brain thinks, okay, I want to do this movement. So the motor cortex is the part that that initiates movement. Initiates movement. But what happens? Just think about this. Um, I can't do something unless I get approval, right? I can't just if the motor cortex did everything that I thought about, like if I did every single small instinct that I had, I'd be uncontrollable, right? How does your motor cortex make the definitive decision that yes, I want to do this movement, right? How it does that is through a structure called the basal ganglia. I don't know if you guys remember, but in my first lecture, I talked about this. Basically, these are deep brain structures. So this is like a section of the brain, like I cut it down this way. And in this, say this is my longitudinal fissure. That's the little um, deep that divides your brain into two lobes. This is my globus pallidus. Sorry, I'm gonna explain. I'm so sorry. I don't know why that keeps happening. Okay, say this is. I'm gonna try this in a different color because why not? Try small triangular structures. Oh my gosh, this is horrendous. Sorry, guys. Having some technical difficulties here, as you can see. Okay, there we go. It's somewhat decent. So what happens is that this signal is transmitted to the brain, right? It's transmitted to the basal ganglia. So the basal ganglia is a bunch of deep brain structures that decide whether to allow the movement to happen or not allow the movement to happen, right? So basically there are two sections. One is your globus pallidus. That's a little globus pallidus. That's a little triangular structure. And your putamen, which is the larger outer section. So you don't need to know the distinctive functions for this. Just know that these are the two structures that make up the basal ganglia. So what happens is your brain sends it over for approval. If your basal ganglia decides with all the sensory information, which is relayed from your thalamus, which is the sensory relay station, if it thinks, sure, why not? You can do the movement. It will send that information over to the motor cortex, which will amplify the signal and send it down the spinal cord. Or it will say, no, I'm not initiating this movement. And so the signal just terminates, right? So how does your body communicate this signal? How does your brain tell your motor cortex to stop, right? So how it does that is through a structure, it's through neurotransmitters, right? It communicates with, so your basal ganglia communicates with your motor cortex through neurons, which communicate with each other using things called neurotransmitters. So how does your body elicit movement? How does it communicate? Well, it's through dopamine. Dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter associated with movement. It's also associated with pleasure, but each neurotransmitter has multiple functions, and dopamine is one of them. So, dopamine is used for initiating movements. It basically tells the motor cortex, yes, propel it down, right? And dopamine is produced in a region of the brain called the substantia nigra. Substantia nigra. I'll get more into this later. But what happens when your brain decides nope? When your basal ganglia decides no, I don't want to initiate the movement. It releases a neurotransmitter called GABA. So if I'm not wrong, the full form of GABA is gamma aminobutyric acid. You don't need to know the full form, just know GABA exists. So I don't know if you guys remember in my inhibitory neuron video, I explained that GABA was an inhibitory neurotransmitter, which means that it stopped action. It told it, no, I don't want it to happen. Whereas dopamine was an excitatory neurotransmitter. It promotes signals happening, right? So now let's discuss what happens if any of these are depleted. Let's just say that, for example, the substantia nigra degenerates. What happens then? Well, I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. If there's not enough dopamine to communicate with the brain, your brain has no way of saying start the movement. Start the movement, right? It can't say elicit the movement. Yeah, start the movement. Oops. So what this means is that there's a block. You can't communicate. It's literally just stopped. There's like a wall. You can't, there's signal activation happening here, but there's no way to tell it to actually do it. So that means that your brain can't communicate with itself, which means that you can't start the movement, which means paralysis. You can't move. But what happens if the inhibitory neurons are there or start to degenerate, right? What happens if GABAergic neurons start to degenerate? Well, what happens in that case is that your body can't tell your signals to stop. What it does is it approves every single action that comes in. Okay, obviously that sounds really bad because you have no control. No control, which basically is like you can't stop. You become impulsive to a whole new level. And I'll explain that, right? So these are actually real diseases. Parkinson's disease, Parkinson's Parkinson's disease is the disease where your brain can't communicate with itself. Dopaminergic neurons, or the neurons that produce dopamine, which is in the substantia nigra, which is a group of neurons in your brainstem, they start to degenerate. So what happens is your brain doesn't have enough dopamine. It can't communicate with other parts, which means that um, Parkinson's patients are usually bedridden by the time the disease is in its advanced stages. So they're paralyzed. However, there's another disease where your GABAergic neurons start to disintegrate, which is known as Huntington's. Huntington's disease is actually one of my favorite diseases to learn about because what it is it degenerates the GABA neurons, right? And the reason this happens is because a mutation in the CAG nucleotide, oops, not GAC, CAG nucleotide. So your CAG nucleotide, in a normal person, there's like a certain range, but for people with Huntington's, they have too much of it. So because they have too much of it, it degenerates all your GABA neurons, which produces exaggerated, uncontrolled movements called chorea. Chorea, right? Your hands start flailing different places, or your legs start to jump out, right? So that's what happens in Huntington's disease. So the degeneration of either one of the neurons is not good. Now the final part I'm going to talk about is the cerebellum. So from our previous videos, we know that the cerebellum is responsible for balance, timing, and even coordination of movements, right? Uh, so if you want to put one foot in front of the other, your cerebellum is mostly responsible for calibrating that, making sure you're stepping in line, all of that stuff. But the cerebellum has a very crucial function that we haven't talked about so far. I want you to imagine yourself riding a bike. Do you actually think about, oh, I need to pedal, I need to balance myself, I need to do this, I need to do that? No, that's because your cerebellum remembers this information. It it basically is that the way that your body needs to be calibrated, or how you need to balance yourself on your bike, your cerebellum remembers all of it, right? And that's the phenomenon of motor learning, right? So motor learning is basically the part where your brain remembers how to do all of this stuff. Like touch typing, for example, your brain is so used to you doing it, you don't think about where each key is. Your brain just knows. That's all due to your cerebellum actually remembering how to do it, right? So it's like second nature. So now I'm going to ask you to think about this is a kind of a common application question. Okay, I want you to imagine a guy on the side of the road trying to walk straight on a yellow line, right? They're trying to walk straight, but they're not able to. They're wobbling all over the place, right? What immediately comes to your mind? For me, I don't know if I've just been watching too many TV shows, but I think, are they drunk, right? You're not able to walk straight. Why is that? Because your cerebellum is responsible for calibrating your movements, making sure you're in sync. But the person who's drunk, they do the exact opposite of that. They're walking all over the place. They're not in sync at all. So what does this tell us about alcohol? Well, first of all, that alcohol is a depressant. A depressant means, so basically alcohol, the active ingredient in it is called ethanol. We'll get more into this into our addiction chapter, which is chapter 13. Videos are coming out soon. Um, what your alcohol does is it acts as depressant, which basically tells your nervous system to go to sleep. Just don't think, you know? So what that does is that your cerebellum won't think. It's not going to do as well, and it's not going to coordinate your movements well enough, right? And another bad effect of it is that the extended use of alcohol actually damages your cerebellum, which is why when for like long-term drinkers, like people have been drinking for like 10, 15 years, even if they're not drunk, they still walk like they're drunk because their cerebellum is damaged to the extent that they're going to look like they're drunk either way, right? So yeah, that's why kids, you should not be drinking, and this is my lecture on voluntary movements. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop a comment or to just email me at stemwme@gmail.com. Thank you. Bye bye.